That was Larry Dossey, who's been at this research on the greater or collective consciousness for many years. He's a real pioneer in this field. And Phil, one of the things you brought up I thought was interesting, and I'm sure Deepak Chopra and others have gone through this. They probably stir up a lot of anger amongst colleagues in traditional medicine when MDs go and do research and promote areas of medicine, of healing that aren't traditionally found in modern medicine in the West, anyway.
Oh, sure. I'm sure people like that are pariahs to many people. They just sort of probably seem to be have gone off the deep end or become religious fanatics or just engaging in pseudoscience and wishful thinking and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I would guess that even when Deepak was a spokesperson for Ayurvedic medicine,
Hmm.
which is a traditional form of medicine on a par with Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I'm sure even that was considered off the reservation and crazy. But things change, and when you get down to questions of the nature of consciousness and does consciousness exist independent of brain activity and healing at a distance, then you're getting really into the realm. It's one thing to be advocating herbs or acupuncture, things that
Right.
can be easily tested. But this is a very different thing. And then you get opposition not just from physicians, but from other scientists, like neuroscientists and even physicists and people like that.
Yeah. Well,
So
it's interesting. People also have to come to a point in their lives where maybe there's something that's real, something that is beneficial to their life, and yet there is no empirical evidence to support that, or maybe studies haven't been figured out, or the instrumentation doesn't exist to endorse, to prove what their experience is. But ultimately, what their experience is not dependent upon empirical evidence. So it's an interesting area, and like you, I have participated in group meditations with sometimes as thousands of people to affect all areas of life's quality worldwide. And I don't know. I've heard people say there were studies that proved it did, and I've heard other people debunk those
yeah,
studies, and I'm not sure. I can say that the experience of meditating, and this was TM with large groups of people, uh, the experience is different, and sometimes I could say more powerful. And it seemed that there was a collective consciousness that I was plugged into, but that was all very intuitive, subjective experience. And I'd,
right.
I'd like to see more research done and
Yeah.
encourage people to have that experience.
And I'm sure every study or every group of studies that come out that push the envelope in any field. I mean, I remember reading Thomas Kuhn's book about the nature of scientific revolutions. In every field of science, there's always new data that that sort of challenge the paradigm, and there's always resistance to it. There's always people who dismiss it, always people who uh, even accuse the researchers of bias or bad science. But as the evidence mounts, it becomes more and more convincing, and the data always win out in the end, and people
Hmm.
have to go with the evidence if they're true scientists. And I think that's what Larry was saying to us, that it's very different now than it was 30 years ago when he
Right.
was first writing about the influence of prayer and consciousness on healing. There's much more willingness to listen. The data has grown, and so I guess these things really just take
Yeah, they
time.
take
And
time. I was speaking to a friend who has been involved in organic farming and or organic products for many, many years. And there's still resistance, but compared to how it was, 20, 30 years ago, it's night and day.
Sure.
And a lot of times it's a groundswell of support amongst people, and people say, "Hey, look, this is good. We do want to get involved." Then I think that it comes about from both the experts endorsing it through empirical evidence, studies and whatnot, but also from just people having that experience. So many people
Yeah.
have had an experience of feeling that they've had some connection with somebody at a distance or whatever, some deep
Hmm.
intuitive insight. So no amount of science can disprove that for them. And I
Right.
do think, and what I would hope to see is more and more research done, and the research done on a high level by people that don't have an agenda, but just are really there to see what's happening and what's not happening. And I'm
Right.
confident that there'll be proof of many of these things that seem out of the realm of science at this point.
Yeah. But though you raise interesting questions here. One is everything that we now consider metaphysical or spiritual subject to the kind of empirical experimentation that uh, science upholds as its standard? Maybe we'll find
Hmm.
that there are certain things that are not amenable to the scientific method as we know it, or maybe
Right.
the scientific method has to start including uh, the subjective side of things or individual consciousness or something. Maybe the scientific method itself has to expand. Or maybe some things will always be beyond the reach of science.
Hmm.
And as you say, there will be people, and there are now, who don't require scientific proof of certain things. It just seems self-evident, or the evidence of history and spiritual expertise, so to speak, is enough. And there are other people for whom that's not enough, and they require scientific evidence. And among those people, there'll be people who will resist it every step of the way, no
Right.
matter how much proof there is. And other people will yield to the evidence. I mean, what always bothers me is people who claim to be rational and value science, behaving in a way that's really not terribly scientific when you reject something and that has plausibility or even could be considered a good hypothesis worth investigating. When you reject it because it doesn't fit your theories or your model of how the world works, then you're not being very scientific.
Right,
So,
right. What's also interesting, and he touched upon it today, he several times quoted physicists, and some of the people doing work in theoretical physics are coming to areas of the physical universe that are difficult to describe, and it seems like many of those descriptions are not unlike the descriptions of ancient seers of
right,
the past and yogis and gurus of the past that talked
right,
about this this field of consciousness,
right,
and how that all will or does relate to physics talking about a grand unification theory of a grand unification theory, and I think a lot of these great scientists have intuited the connection between the two. I can't think of his name, but I met the gentleman that wrote the book, The Tao of Physics, years ago. And
Fritjof Capra.
yeah, he was at a conference I was at.
Yeah,
Brian Josephson, who was a Nobel laureate in physics years
right.
ago, was there. And a number of these people, were talking about the relationship of consciousness to quantum physics. So, these guys were thinking in that direction.
And
And
this is not new. I mean, Fritz Capra wrote that book
third,
40 years ago,
right.
back in the 70s. And I have a chapter on science in American Veda, and this link, the insights of physicists and psychologists who are well grounded in the scientific method, uh, being open to the ideas that we think of as Vedic, or from Buddhism and Hinduism. Uh, this goes back a long way. I mean, Nikola Tesla was a friend of Swami Vivekananda, and if you look at his writings, he's talking about prana and akasha.
Hmm.
And then, Schrodinger was, a century ago, and he was talking about Vedanta, and so was Heisenberg in the mid. So this goes back a long way, and now as people become more and more familiar with the language of quantum physics and so forth, it's just more and more people seeing these connections that people like Capra wrote about a long time ago.
Well, it's a very interesting area, and I think that another area of science, along with quantum physics, that's going very deep into reality is some of these neuroscientists and some of the work being done in neuroscience and the brain. And what he
Yeah,
said today was fascinating, that the brain isn't the producer of consciousness, but rather the filter through which consciousness comes. And thinking
right.
of consciousness actually as stuff, or maybe the most fundamental stuff of the universe. I do think, even though to me right now, I can't, it's inconceivable to me how these things could be measured and objectified,
Right. That's
but I
the
would think
that's
at
the
some point,
challenge, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. But again, that whole idea of subjective and objective means of gaining knowledge, and one not being necessarily more real than the other, or so,
Yeah, and the neuroscience on meditation and mindfulness
right,
practice and all that, in a certain way, can work against this because it's all focused on phenomena in the brain, and it's very easy for people to just conclude that these practices are just different ways of the brain doing stuff, and it doesn't necessarily prove there's anything that consciousness exists independent of the
right,
brain. In
right.
some way, you could look at it as reinforcing that notion. So I don't know how you study that. I'll leave that to scientists who are open to the idea to design experiments, but I'm sure that's a major challenge. It's easy to come up with a theory, but getting empirical evidence is another thing. I mean, one thing in Larry's book, in One Mind, I was looking at it, and in there, in the press release, we didn't get into that. He says there are 6 areas in consciousness research in which studies have been replicated in labs around the world, each area giving odds against chance of around 1,000,000,000 to 1. And he lists, different categories of research. And so people listening can easily look on his
Hmm.
in his book or probably online and see some of those studies.
Right. Well, I also wanted to say that, for years when I used to teach TM, when I teach meditation courses, people would start because they heard of research that was done on how the body benefited from it or whatever. But once you start a practice of meditation, you continue to do it not based upon some research that was done, but but in terms of your own personal experience. It makes me feel good. I feel
Yeah,
relaxed, and I have these experiences. I don't need science to tell me if that's a real experience or not. I'm having it. It's real to me, and that's what motivates me to do it. So
right. And people will have the same feeling about. I meet a lot of people. They'll see research like the kind Larry Dossey told us about, or that Charlie Tart told us about when we interviewed him,
mhm.
and they'll say, "Well, I don't need science to tell me, that telepathy is real. I experience that all the time." But those people are not going to be able to convince others. That's where the data comes in.
Right. Well, I enjoyed having him, and look
Yeah.
forward to having him back on. And for our listeners out there, spread the word. Let people know about Spirit Matters at spiritmatterstalk.com, and we're on iTunes and SoundCloud, and we're very accessible. And Phil, I've been looking at. We have analytics to look at who's listening where, and we've had listeners now from over 50 countries and several thousand cities worldwide. So, yeah, the more listeners, the more fun it is to get the word out. But I think we've had some fascinating people, and we got some great folks coming up, and we're always
Hmm.
happy to get your emails or thoughts on who we might have, recommendations on who we might have on the show.
All right.
Till next time.
See you then.
Right.